The gravel crunched under hundreds of boots, a rhythmic, bone-jarring sound that vibrated through the soles of his feet. David Turner stood rigid, his spine locked, sweat carving hot channels through the dust on his forehead. The drill instructor paced the line, his voice a jagged blade that sliced through the humid morning air. Every command was a test of reaction time. Every failure was a public correction. David felt the burn in his thighs, the tremor in his hands, but he did not move. He watched the instructor stop inches from his face, eyes scanning for a single lapse in posture. In that moment of absolute exposure, David understood the unspoken law of the barracks. Survival was not found in strength or speed alone. It was found in the repetition of simple, tested movements under the weight of unrelenting pressure. He kept his eyes fixed forward. He locked his focus on the horizon. If he could maintain this level of control here, where the cost of a mistake was a screaming lecture or 1,000 push-ups, he could apply that same logic to everything else. He was no longer just a recruit. He was a machine built for execution. The paychecks arrived like clockwork, and with them came the noise. Within hours, the barracks transformed. Engines roared in the parking lot as new muscle cars pulled in, their exhaust fumes thick and heavy. Inside, the common room filled with the glow of new screens and the chatter of men bragging about their latest tech purchases. David watched from the edge of the circle. He saw the excitement, the temporary thrill of the acquisition, and the inevitable cycle that followed. He saw the same men, 3 weeks later, counting down the days until the next payday because their accounts were drained to zero. The temptation was a physical weight. He felt it in the urge to join them, to feel the immediate gratification of a new purchase, to be part of the group. Instead, he stood up. He walked to his bunk and sat in the quiet. He watched his peers chase a ghost of status, while he considered the reality of his own balance. He felt the pull of the current, the collective pressure to spend, but he planted his feet. He chose to look at the empty space where his money should have been and decided to fill it with something else entirely. He was setting his own path. The barracks were dim, lit only by the low hum of distant generators. David retreated to his bunk, pulling the thin curtain tight to block out the noise of the common room. He reached under his mattress and pulled out a worn book. He clicked his flashlight on, the small beam cutting through the dark, and rested it against his pillow. He began to read. The pages were dense with logic, not orders. He read about compounding, about patience, and about the long game. He paused, turned the page back, and read the passage again. The words hit him with the same force as a field manual. It was a strategy for survival, just with a different objective. He realized that wealth was not about the immediate gain of a car or a watch. It was about the slow, steady accumulation of options. He saw the math laid out clearly. Buy quality, hold long, let the system work. The flashlight flickered, but he didn't adjust it. He kept reading, his mind tracing the trajectory of a decade, then two. The mission shifted. He wasn't just here to serve his time, he was here to build his future. He closed the book, the silence of the bunk now heavy with a new, singular purpose. The next morning, the sun barely scraped the horizon as David walked to the bank located just outside the base gates. His boots hit the pavement with a rhythmic, steady cadence. He entered the building, the air conditioning hitting him with a sharp, sterile chill. There was no line. He walked to the counter, his hands steady, and requested a meeting with a representative. He didn't ask for advice. He didn't ask for options. He laid out his plan with the precision of a field order. He wanted a fixed percentage of his monthly salary to vanish the moment it hit his account. He filled out the forms, his pen moving across the paper without a tremor. The representative looked at him, curious about the austerity of the request. But David offered no explanation. He simply pushed the paperwork forward. He watched the screen as the automated transfer was keyed in. A command was entered, a digital gate was locked, and the funds would now move into an investment account before he ever had the chance to see them. He stood up, the transaction complete. He walked back out into the bright morning light, his bank balance technically lower, but his trajectory finally set. The machine was now running on its own. The cycles of service repeated, year after year. Deployments came and went, each marked by the same ritual. When the paychecks hit, his fellow Marines flooded the base parking lot with new, financed vehicles and high-end electronics. They lived for the weekend, their bank accounts draining as fast as they filled. David remained a ghost in their system. He lived in the same barracks, maintained the same gear, and watched his investment accounts grow with the silence of a rising tide. Every promotion brought a raise, but he never upgraded his lifestyle. That surplus went directly into index funds, fueling the machine he had built. He spent his downtime reading quarterly reports instead of chasing temporary thrills. He felt no envy, only a growing detachment from the cycle of debt surrounding him. He focused on the math. Every dollar invested was a soldier in an army of capital, working long after he clocked out. While others complained about interest rates on their loans, David reviewed his growing portfolio. He was not just saving money, he was buying time. The years condensed into a steady, rhythmic accumulation. He kept his head down, ignored the trends, and let the compounding interest do the heavy lifting in the background, far from the noise of the base. The sun reflected off the cracked windshield of David's sedan, an object of ridicule in a parking lot filled with late-model trucks. A young private, barely out of training, leaned against his own gleaming vehicle nearby. He pointed a finger at the rust spots on David's fender, his laugh sharp and loud enough to draw eyes from the nearby barracks. "How long are you going to drive that junker, Turner? You are making enough to upgrade." David didn't look at the private immediately. He wiped a smudge of oil from his thumb, the silence stretching until the private's smirk faltered. David looked up, his gaze steady and devoid of annoyance. The private shifted his weight, the confidence in his posture leaking away. "I am not buying a car," David said, his voice low and devoid of defensive edge. "I am buying my freedom." He walked to the driver's side door, the metal groaning as he pulled the handle. The private stayed silent, his hand hovering near his own ignition. David slid into the seat, turned the key, and the engine rattled to life. He didn't look back as he pulled out of the spot, leaving the private standing alone in the heat, the weight of the statement hanging in the air between them. The base was quiet on that Tuesday. A rare, midday lull settled over the barracks, leaving the hallways empty and the air still. David sat at his desk, the fluorescent light humming overhead. His laptop sat closed in front of him, a gray slab of metal that held the sum of his labor. He took a breath, the air cool against his skin, and placed his hands on the edges of the device. He had waited years for this specific afternoon. He flipped the screen open. The glow hit his face, sharp and bright. His cursor hovered over the file marked with a simple, singular date. He clicked. The spreadsheet occupied the entire screen, a grid of rows and columns that stretched into the past. He didn't rush. He moved his index finger across the trackpad, scrolling through the entries. Every deposit, every dividend, every compounding cycle was there, logged with military precision. He traced the lines of growth with his eyes. The numbers shifted, updated, and aligned. He leaned closer, his chin resting on his palm, scanning the bottom cell where the total rested. He felt the weight of the silence around him, the lack of distraction, and the focus he had cultivated over a decade of service. He was finally ready to see if the machine had done its work. The numbers on the screen did not move, but the context of the entire grid shifted as David's eyes traced the final column. He isolated the row for his current month's military salary, a figure he had tracked for years as the primary baseline for his existence. Beside it, he toggled the view to his total passive income derived from the index funds and accumulated interest. For the first time, the passive figure was larger. It was not a marginal difference. The gap was clear, undeniable, and permanent. He blinked, refreshed the page, and watched the data re-render. The result remained unchanged. The machine he had constructed through thousands of small automated transfers was now producing more than the labor he provided to the service. He pushed his chair back, the metal legs scraping against the floor, and looked at the wall. The paycheck, once the singular gravity of his life, was now mathematically eclipsed. He tapped the desk, a steady, rhythmic beat, acknowledging the shift. The system had taken over. The engine was self-sustaining, fueled by the compounding force he had fed for over a decade. He stared at the screen, watching the digits, knowing that the necessity of his own active labor had officially reached its end. David turned his attention to the final cell, the one labeled net worth. He had calculated this sum 100 times in his head, but seeing it rendered in black and white was a different order of reality. His finger hovered over the enter key. He pressed it. The screen refreshed, the rows collapsed, and the final tally populated. 1 million. The number sat there, static and precise. He leaned back, his spine snapping against the chair, and looked at the ceiling. He did not cheer, he did not call out. He simply looked at the digit again to ensure it was not a calculation error. He checked the formulas, verified the asset values, and confirmed the totals one last time. There was no doubt. The $1 million mark had been breached. This was the target he had set in the dark of the barracks years ago. The objective that had dictated every choice he made. The war was over. The years of discipline, the missed opportunities, the refusal to chase the trends that had claimed the paychecks of his peers, it had all collapsed into this single, static figure. He sat in the silence of the room, listening to the hum of the cooling fan, knowing that every choice from this moment forward was entirely his own. David reached out and closed the laptop lid with a soft, final click. The screen went black, and the room grew instantly quieter. He stood up, pushed the chair into its original position, and walked toward the door. His movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely his own. He reached the heavy handle, turned it, and stepped out of the building. The sunlight hit him immediately, bright and unyielding. It was the same light he had seen every day during his service, but today it carried a different weight. He took a breath of the open air, unburdened by the requirements of a schedule or the pressure of a command. He looked at the parking lot, then toward the horizon. The mission he had defined in the cramped barracks a decade ago was finished. He had traded years of rigid self-control for the capacity to choose every future action. He began to walk, not toward a post or a formation, but toward the open road. He was no longer tied to the cycle of a paycheck. He was free, and for the first time in his adult life, the path ahead was completely blank, waiting for him to decide where it led.